Thomas Jefferson famously asked that his tombstone declare him to be the author of the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. He also should have had carved the author of the concept of the wall of separation between church and state, since that, as much as the Declaration and the Virginia Statute, has influenced the history of our country. Thomas L. Dreisbach's book, Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State, is a magnificent and necessary analysis of this Jeffersonian concept. Unlike many, Dreisbach explains in detail, down to the peppercorn cheese, why Jefferson included the separation of church and state in the wall he sent to the Danbury Baptist Community. Although the Baptist community simply wanted to congratulate Jefferson on his ascendancy to the presidency, to, quote, defend republicanism and to baffle all the arts of aristocracy, unquote, Jefferson took the opportunity to explain why he did not proclaim days of prayer and thanksgiving, as Washington and John Adams had done. The reason for this is because Jefferson said that the First Amendment established a wall of separation between the church and the state, i.e. the federal government. The Constitution gave no branch of the federal government the authority to declare days to be days of fasting and prayer or thanksgiving. And so Jefferson, with the 10th Amendment as a guide, decided that such activity was rightfully executed at the state and local level. And this activity was perfectly mirrored in Jefferson's actions, since as a member of the Virginia House of Burgess, he had helped craft a bill calling for a day of fasting and prayer, and as governor of Virginia, he had publicly proclaimed a day of thanksgiving. But while the separation of church and state seems to coincide with the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty, this concept changed the course of constitutional history and not for the better. As historian John Butler explains, Jefferson, quote, subtly shifted the First Amendment's meaning in the most complex ways, unquote. This was because, as Dreisbach explains, quote, whereas the First Amendment forbids certain laws and in this way limits civil government, the phrase made famous by Jefferson seems to require that church and state stay apart and thus, apparently, limits not only civil government but also religious organizations, unquote. This mentality is contrary to that of the other founders, such as George Washington, as Vincent Munoz writes in his piece, George Washington on Religious Liberty. Washington, quote-unquote, like many, if not most of the founders, saw religion as necessary to government and civil society. Religion fostered morality, and morality nurtured virtue, without which republican government was impossible. This fact, however, did not stop the Supreme Court from declaring the Jeffersonian concept in 1879 to, quote, may be accepted almost as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the First Amendment thus secured, unquote, even though, as it has been pointed out, Jefferson was not a part of the Constitutional Convention nor the First Federal Congress in which the First Amendment was proposed, debated, and passed. But the power of the concept seems to lie in the power of metaphors in general. Chad Oldfather, in his research, identified 5 basic principles for why metaphors are used in law. They serve as linguistic decoration, they make the abstract concrete, they create an economy of expression, they serve as a disguised form of analogical thinking, and they have the potential to unleash creativity. And while all these traits are good, there is a downside to all of them. As Lord Mansfield wrote, quote, nothing in law is so apt to mislead as a metaphor, unquote. And this is because metaphors, quote, equate 2 things that are not identical, and so the opportunity for distortion is always present, unquote. And thus an unscrupulous judge can use a metaphor to advance his own agenda rather than the law. This was demonstrated amiably in the 1947 Supreme Court case, Everson v. Board of Education, in which Justice Hugo Black declared that the founders in the First Amendment had intended to create a quote-unquote high and impregnable wall between church and state. Whereas Jefferson's wall separated the established church from the federal government, Black's wall separated all religious influences from all civic government. And critics of the wall have maintained that if taken in this way, the metaphor can be used to muzzle those outside the federal government, and this is proven to be true. Prior to the 2012 election, the IRS warned pastors not to speak of quote-unquote political issues in the pulpit. After the Hobby Lobby case this summer, Senator Chuck Schumer told Christians that they had a choice between their faith and starting a business. And also after the Hobby Lobby case, the Huffington Post asked, quote, about the compatibility between being a Catholic and being a good citizen, unquote. And it would appear that, contrary to the founders and even Jefferson, The wall of separation is becoming more and more an iron curtain.